Trudeau announces hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid, and we commemorate D-Day. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. So, Trudeau, he's come under fire again. I'm starting to feel kind of bad for this guy actually. It's becoming a trend now. So, his most recent announcement is hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid. The money is supposed to fund some new initiatives that range from sexual, reproductive, maternal, and child health programs. One motivation for this increase in spending is supposedly to fill a global funding gap left by the United States of America. So, the US recently rescinded some of their international abortion spending, and we're picking up the tab. That very premise itself is majorly flawed. A giant economy, arguably one of the best in the world, is getting their bill footed by Canada? We're about 1/10 the size if you haven't noticed. Maybe we can afford to pitch in a little bit. The idea though that we can afford anything right now, that itself is even debatable, but let's say for the sake of argument, we do have a little bit of money left over. There are major issues facing Canada at this very moment, ranging from homelessness to healthcare. All of these are pretty big deals. There is a reason why on airplanes, they tell you to put your own air mask on before you try to help other people. How come? Well, if you stretch yourself too thin, you may work towards the detriment of all parties involved instead of helping anyone. Aside from that, there's also the psychological message that's being sent, that someone will be there to fill the void. If we're signaling to America that they can just save money and stop funding, no worries, we'll swoop in and take care of it. What's to stop them from exploring that relationship even further? I'm sure the United States would love to push over all of their initiatives to us. If they start pulling funding for other things, is Canada also going to swoop in? Our pockets are not as deep as theirs, and we simply don't have the capacity, so I'm not too sure why we're acting like we do. In addition to the announced additional funding, they're also upping the aid given to international women's initiatives. The new value is set at $1.4 billion. It was previously 1.1, so it's a jump of $300 million now. At this very point in time, we enter the realm of political correctness, and it detracts from the issue at hand. Obviously, women are suffering tremendously in certain parts of the world, and they do need help. There is a moral claim you can make that it's not right to abandon them under any circumstance. Canada rightfully does have a certain portion of the budget allocated to foreign aid. All of that is fine and very logical, but increasing your cost to beyond reasonable limits, well, that comes with pros and cons. The pros are that it's a feel-good move and it's going to help people in need. The cons are that the money going abroad is not going to be helping those within our very country who are struggling themselves. There has to be a certain balance allocated here. Also, just by announcing something and having good intentions does not mean the outcome is inherently going to be good. And I'm going to touch on that in just a second. But first, let's talk about international philanthropy. I believe in a similar framework as that of a progressive tax structure. The better off your country is, the more you should contribute. Canada does decently for itself, top 20 in the world, so it makes sense to spend proportionately. China and the United States, well, those are two of the biggest economies that have ever existed. My main concern is that we're footing the bill when logically, other nations have a greater global responsibility relative to their wealth. There's also a certain argument to be had here that it is not the most effective approach to actually solving the problem. And this is where I get back to the point I just made about having good intentions does not always equate to having good outcomes or the best outcomes or the most effective outcomes for that matter. A lot of women are suffering at the hands of government and societies that are not modern in their worldviews. Places like Saudi Arabia still treat women as objects. What effect is money going to have on that situation? Even if it ends up in the hands of activist groups, there's only so much they can do. Real change that will better the lives of women around the globe needs to come from these societies themselves. You can fund backwards thinking parts of the world as much as you like, but it's useless if the people are unwilling to adopt the values we espouse upon them. So, how do you get to the people? Well, that itself is very complex. It seems to me that one possibility is via the government. A local political movement is going to be far more impactful than one from abroad. I think we can all agree that certain practices like a wife tracking app commonly found in Saudi Arabia, well, those are borderline barbaric. Having societal norms and habits like that only fan the flames of inaction. If there are instances where we, Western countries, spot injustices like those, I think a more productive approach is via political channels. You meet with the guilty governments and you figure out a path forward, and you can go about that in two different ways. You can appeal to their logic and good senses, maybe demonstrating that a country has more potential for growth if all of its citizens are treated fairly, as it will make them more incentivized to become productive. Or, if you don't want to take that approach or the country is unwilling to hear that side of things, you can always take the path that America has chosen numerous times in the past, which is to simply strong arm them. You threaten them with tariffs, embargoes, unfavorable trade deals, and such. The message is you target their economy. If the economy is at stake, you can bet you'll see results. The downside with the later approach, though, is you may gain a form of reluctant compliance, but it will begin to set a precedent that can be adopted by future generations. You can even do the opposite of what we currently do and threaten to pull a lot of humanitarian aid if it's not actually going towards solving the problem politically. It has to be a grassroots change, and if you threaten to take away all that money, as well as giving them economic incentives to abide by, well, that really sets a flame under them and it'll get them to move, because as I said, there are women who need change right now, and it's a slow-moving process when it really doesn't have to be. We can make that change now and they can adopt to it throughout time. But simply increasing the amount of money we give to these countries seems to be more like a temporary fix than actually fixing the societal things that need to be tended to. I say this time and time again. I'm no fan of band-aid solutions. They need a continual renewal, and if you take away the band-aid, then the problem will still exist in all of its glory. We deem this as a moral issue, and any logical person would. So, we need to take more effective actions to stifle the problem. It's really as simple as that. The execution itself does come with challenges and it has to be thought through. But the path doesn't take a genius to discover. Once you enact certain standards, then the funding isn't as much of a band-aid anymore because it can begin to build the infrastructure to preserve justice on its own. Eventually, that turns into a self-sustaining model if handled correctly. It means in the future, you won't need to give money anymore. And that's really the goal of humanitarian aid. It's not so you can keep giving money from now until the end of time. It's so you give money, or you put funds up, maybe not even give money. You invest, you put funds up, so the problem can be solved and one day it will not be necessary to continue. That's the ultimate goal, but currently it seems like we have the opposite mindset. Just keep pouring money into it and don't care about the end vision. Just think about here and now. And once again, it is the issue with such short-sighted politicians. All they think about is the next election cycle. And maybe it's not their fault, but those 4-year terms, they put a damper on how far you can look into the future. It's a shame, and it's not conductive of actually solving issues. It's not like the women who were trying to save are opposed to this idea either. We aren't jamming Western values down their throats. It's a welcomed move towards a more progressive society, and at least half of those populations are going to be okay with it. Some people attack Trudeau's spending by labeling it as exporting an ideological agenda. I do not feel that that is framing things accurately, and it comes off as a dishonest attack on Trudeau. I think you have a better case against it, like the ones I've outlined, saying he's trying to push upon an agenda. What agenda are they really talking about? It does not strike me as political. Increasing the standard of living for less fortunate people around the world is more so a moral discussion, and it doesn't seem to have a political aisle per se. What I mean by that is simply within our nation, helping those in need. Well, you'll find people on both parties, or any party for that matter, who can support that idea. The way they'll go about the support, well, that differs, but at its core, it's not really a controversial ideology to have. It's not really an agenda. All too common is the practice of mislabeling things in politics to suit an agenda, though, and that itself is what's actually misleading here. Trudeau has done it, and the opposition is also guilty. If we can be candid for just a second, we can all recognize the injustice that exists. The debate occurs in terms of what the best path forward is, though. Trudeau is going to get flack for this, and at the end of the day, it just feels like so much more thought into permanent solutions is what we really need. Canadians at home are also struggling, so it rubs them the wrong way when their needs are being put below those who are abroad. And that's just the fact of it. I'm not saying that's the morally correct stance to have, but it's what's happening. They feel like they're being disenfranchised and it's not looking good to them. You can make the argument easily that the worst off Canadian is still living a 100 times better life than someone abroad, so the money is being spent more productively or efficiently. But at the end of the day, it's still the Canadian government, and it's something that has to be addressed. This really has turned into a hotbed issue when it shouldn't have become that at all. So we'll see how it transpires, and I'll update you on the latest. Now we move on to a very interesting topic, and that is the D-Day memorials. So war leaders are commemorating the 75th anniversary of D-Day. First, let's talk about the historical context of the event and why it's worth remembering. So the official name for the military operation was actually called Operation Neptune, but it's referred to more commonly now as D-Day. All of these events took place during the Second World War, and it was the single event with the largest seaborne invasion in history. It was a grand-scale attack on the German front. So at this point in time, keep in mind that Germany was occupying large masses of territory in Europe, and they were spreading terror quite fast. The Allies, which included the US, Britain, and Canada, and still a lot of other powerhouse countries, they were facing off against the Axis powers, who weren't really pushovers either. They had a strong military. They had Germany and Italy. Those two countries were leading the attack in Europe, and they also had Japan, who was wreaking havoc across Asia. So, the D-Day operations were pointed at liberating France from German control, as well as really penetrating the German line of defense and establishing a base to expand from that offers them some form of strategic advantage. So, the Allies, first of all, before D-Day even happened, they trolled Germany by launching a fake plan of attack. It was meant to deceive the Axis powers and keep the true area of interest a secret from them. So D-Day actually had a couple of different targets. Normandy ended up being the one they went with, but to make sure that Germany didn't just congregate all their forces on that front and they were ready for an attack, they made these plans where it seemed like they were going somewhere else. So Germany was confused and they weren't really too sure what was going on. As a result, it ended up doing well actually, as Germany kind of fell for that, and the Allied forces were able to launch an effective attack. A combined total of 24,000 troops landed on the shore of France at midnight, and support pulled in after that. It ended up reaching a total of 156,000 troops. The Germans were still ready though. They had defenses on the beach. It was fortified, and as soon as our troops landed, keep in mind they came in from the sea, most of them. Some came in via the air, but these huge underwater bunkers were coming out of nowhere, and soldiers were emerging from it. So, the German troops, they let off a heavy rain of fire at our soldiers. That itself is pretty nerve-wracking if you think about it. You get out of this metal contraption, and you land in enemy territory. Now you have to rush through a beach under fire by a storm of bullets. Strategic positioning made certain areas more bloody than others. One particular location was especially bad because the Germans had a high ground. They were able to find a large cliff and they mounted artillery. So for them it was easy pickings. They were just raining down bullets and taking out soldiers as they tried to progress. And because they had the high ground, it was hard to fire back against them. So that area itself resulted in a lot of casualties. The battle raged across 5 different sections of land, and both sides, the Axis and the Allies, suffered thousands of casualties. Some days later, on June 12th, all of the beaches were cleared and they were connected, which established a foothold for the Allies to expand their power from. This battle is held in such high regard because it's viewed by many to be the beginning of the end of the war. It was a major victory for the Allies, and it forced Germany to now fight on multiple fronts. This was after nearly 5 years of war. In that time frame, Germany was able to conquer most of Western Europe. It's said that when the Allies stormed the city, the French citizens, who were basically prisoners of war at this point, they were so happy, they were cheering and they were crying because they were now freed from occupation. And it was really a strategic victory too, because once you carve out a path on land, it lets you accumulate your power and roll throughout the country, going through other occupied territory until you reach your goal. In this case, it was Germany. Paris was liberated on August 25th, 1944. So it did take some time for them to progress throughout France and get to the capital. And Germany, for reference, surrendered on May 7th, 1945, less than a year later after D-Day. So you can see why people say D-Day was the beginning of the end. The Allies were able to breach their line effectively, and from there they were able to expand and conquer. Success typically has a compounding effect as well in war, because as you free these cities, the citizens can now join your cause. You simultaneously get to weaken your enemy and bolster your forces. It also allows more angles to attack. By getting into a strategic location within Europe, effectively right in front of the German lines, you can diversify your approach. You can use land now, you have the air assaults, and you have sea. Even with the land alone, you can now flank and perform a multitude of other tactics. You just have more room to operate, and it's better for your forces. One thing that adds to the legacy of this military invasion was the success. It was not really guaranteed going into it. These soldiers were walking right into the lion's den and trying to punch through it. As they landed on the beach and they ran across the sand, they were met with heavy rains of bullets. It was a tremendous sacrifice and a venture into the unknown. The tide of war could have easily shifted if the Allies lost this campaign. Having your resources wiped out and vulnerable to retaliation, well, that would not be ideal for the Allies. Then you also have to factor in that losing in Normandy would mean they wouldn't have a foothold to expand from. They were able to take advantage of that location and really deal a massive blow to Germany. Not having it, well, you could foreseeably see the war going on for much longer, and it's uncertain how things would have played out then. So, these soldiers who were lost, they definitely deserve to be saluted, and the veterans, they too need to be saluted. It was a tremendous win that was only made possible by the selfless actions of our combined military forces. They died and they fought so we could have a better chance at peace. We do not want a repeat of the horrors of World War, so we have to remember. Well, that about does it for today. Thanks for joining me on the Perri platform. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and follow us on Twitter at Perri Platform. I'll see you soon.